Every other week, we take a deeper look at the economics, policies, issues, and politics of the world's fastest growing region in our Asia 360 segment. We have a couple of topics to go through today, including Canada's broader strategy in Asia, as well as canola. And joining me once again, as he does every 2 weeks, is Jeff Reeves, Vice President of Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Now, you just got back from Hong Kong, where we saw the 4th annual meeting of Asia Business Leaders Advisory Council. Tell me a little bit, for anyone who's unfamiliar with this council, what function it serves.
Well, so it's an informal discussion venue for some of the bigger companies, Canadian companies that are operating in Asia. Part of our advisory group consists of CEOs from those industries. We also bring in people that are in charge of key development projects, such as the digital supercluster. Right now, we had representatives from there. We also had policy makers, people from universities throughout the region. And the idea is to bring Canadian CEOs and policymakers together with their Asian counterparts. So about half of the delegation this time was from Asia, specifically from Hong Kong for this event because we were based in Hong Kong.
Interesting. And what was the nature of the conversations? What were some of the highlights?
So, of course, a lot of the discussion is around how Canada can better position itself in the Asia Pacific on the commercial side. Of course, that has policy implications. So a lot of discussion was about the way that the Canadian government could support Canadian interests, commercial interests throughout the region. Some of the findings were pretty general around the idea of course, the increased desire for funding, government-backed funding, opportunities around small and medium-sized enterprises, Canadian small and medium-sized enterprises to scale in the Asia-Pacific, what it would take to support them. Again, funding was one of those issues that was identified. The other was just continued government support. In many places in Asia, it's very important to have that government official in the room when you're doing business because so many deals are done through that kind of high-level engagement.
I've spoken to you before about how looking at Asia as one region, it's overwhelming, it's daunting, and doesn't necessarily do justice to the smaller economic opportunities in specific countries or smaller regions. Does it make sense to have sort of this pan-Asian strategy, or ultimately do we need to break it down?
I think looking at the region as a whole has strategic value in helping you understand the importance of it as an emerging area. We know that within the next 10 years, for example, the largest middle class in the world will be concentrated in Asia. That said, it's important to have a country-by-country strategy because they're so different. And a lot of what we do at my foundation is to try to make that message clear to our stakeholders that if you're going to China, if you're going to India, if you're going to Singapore, you're going to have a different strategy. The conditions on the ground are much different.
From an Asian business leader perspective, as many of them were in the room at this advisory council, do you think that they take Canada's commitment to the region seriously? I know that's been questioned in the past. Is that starting to change?
No, I think it's still a question. I think, unfortunately, one of the things that we heard repeatedly was there needs to be continued engagement, not just from business interests, but from the Canadian government. And I think that as Canadian business interests grow throughout the region and the opportunities for greater engagement grow, having that parallel support from the government is going to be crucial.
Were there conversations too about opportunities for, say, these companies and leaders in Canada? So looking the other way at this two-way relationship.
I mean, that's part of it, of course. The idea, again, there is making sure that Canada is being effective in communicating to its Asian partners opportunities. One of the things that I did at this meeting was to present some of our findings around polling, where we talked to business leaders in the Asia Pacific around opportunities in Canada, specifically this issue. And what we found is that there's a high degree of desirability for engagement with Canada. But again, that there's a lot of uncertainty around the policy and the regulatory environment, where the actual opportunities are, and how exactly to engage. And other countries in the region, like Australia, have very, very kind of cohesive strategies for engagement, and they're able to put their message out as a nation. So when you think about engagement with Australia in Asia, it's about Australia. It's not about individual provinces or states. It's a very comprehensive approach. And I think that's something right now that Canada unfortunately lacks.
And I know Australia for quite some time has seen itself very much as part of the Asian Pacific region. Canada, we're maybe newer to that. We have the gateway to Asia for North America America. We have our new CPTPP. What kind of conversations are being had around maybe educating Canadians about the opportunities and familiarizing ourselves with maybe our new role in this region?
So that was a point that was raised as being critical. I've spent time in Australia. I taught in Australia. And one of the things that you can see is there is an effort from the Australian government to put money into education, into secondary and higher education, to make sure that the next generation of Australian students and business people have what we would call Asian competency. Mm-hmm. And from my foundational perspective, this is a huge priority. And it's something that we repeatedly heard at this council as something that the Canadian government needs to invest in, Canadian institutions of higher education, and secondary students or secondary education institutions have to start thinking about. Now, that competency includes everything from having training in Asian languages to Asian culture, to providing opportunities for either Canadian students or early career individuals to go and engage in internships or co-ops, in particular around areas where Canada has value add. So tech, artificial intelligence. There was a lot of talk about how to link the superclusters back into the Asian markets, both in terms of opportunities for engagement, but also for opportunities for back and forth education.
That would be very interesting. Now, I have to ask, this took place in Hong Kong. And of course, if you take the temperature of the room, or you mentioned polling of business leaders here in Canada, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what Canada's relationship is like with China and what it will be going forward. What was the mood in the room? Did that come up?
So we were actually quite happy that this year we decided to have the event in Hong Kong, simply because it showed a continued area of engagement between Canada and China, despite the fact that there's high-level tensions going on at the government-to-government level. One of the things that we heard repeatedly from our Hong Kong counterparts was that Hong Kong is a special place. It remains a special place in terms of access to China, in terms of engagement around issues related to regulations, the rule of law. It's a place where Canadian firms can go and make sure that their intellectual property is protected, make sure that their contracts are honored, and at the same time have a window into the broader Chinese market and work with companies, work with individuals that have that deep regional knowledge. So there was a big push from the Hong Kong side for greater engagement between Canada and Hong Kong.
So at this point in time, it continues to be maybe a point of stability in the region, despite a lot of uncertainty between Canada and China?
Certainly, that's the way that the Hong Kong government officials that we engaged with presented the opportunities there. Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about Canada's relationship with China. Of course, sure. Canola in the news now. Yeah. Help put this in a more global context for me in terms of what China's trying to do here.
So for a lot of people that have watched Chinese foreign policy for a long time, this wasn't a big surprise. In fact, that it hadn't happened sooner was a little bit more of a surprise. China has a long history of using what we'd call, economic coercion to achieve political ends. As early as 2010, we saw China stepping forward and blocking exports of, for example, soya from Argentina after the Argentinian president filed an anti-dumping measure against China at the WTO. We've seen similar issues around the exports of bananas from the Philippines, around the export from China to Japan of rare earths after some conflict between the two countries over territory in what we say the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. We've seen similar economic pressure put on South Korea around its anti-missile program that it's deployed. And of course, with Norway, after it gave the Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo the Nobel Prize in 2010, we saw a drop in the export of Norwegian salmon to China and a drawdown in Chinese tourism going back to Norway. So this is pretty standard of the Chinese playbook, but it is something that is new to Canada and is something that you have to start thinking about in the broader engagement strategy between the two countries.
Is it an effective strategy?
Thus far, it's been completely effective. Yeah. Putting pressure on states through that economic means has been very effective. It's forced them to come to the table to negotiate. It's forced them to make conditional accommodations for China. The Philippines is probably the most glaring example of that, where that pressure was put on on the exports of banana, which is a really important export commodity for the Philippines. And at the same time that the Philippine President Duterte came into office, he really did shift his foreign policy focus away from partnership with the United States towards accommodation with China. So yes, unfortunately, up to this point, China has every reason to believe that this sort of economic coercion will be successful.
And I imagine on the Canadian side, of course, Canada has to be fairly careful in how it chooses to respond. What can we learn from examples around the world or countries around the world that have had to deal with China in this way?
Well, Norway is a good example because, of course, it's a country where rule of law is very established and democratic norms are very deeply entrenched. And one thing that you do unfortunately see is that if you do take a principled stand to this and decide that you're not going to respond to the coercion, chances are it could go on for quite a long time and unfortunately could also spread to other areas. One thing that we have seen, I think I just mentioned, is the fact that probably a second area that China can put on pretty serious economic pressure is through tourism. In this case, I think the Norwegian example is very important. South Korean example is very important. Again, the Philippines, all of those instances where you saw the initial target was the export market or the import market, it did move over towards tourism and in some instances actually even affected things like student exchange or overseas students. Yeah.
Obviously, we'll see how Canada responds to this. And I mentioned it probably has to be careful in how it chooses to respond. But aside from just giving China what it wants,
right.
If you put your shoes in the Canadian government, I mean, what should it be doing now? What will it be analyzing and assessing?
I mean, this is core to the risk of dealing with China. And unfortunately, there's asymmetry between China and Canada in many ways. Canada doesn't have a lot of leverage in this particular set of problems. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a lot that it can do. It can continue to push around areas of regulation. It could bring a complaint to the WTO because at this point, putting these restrictions on canola, even if they are around what China says are concerns around pest issues or public health issues, you can bring those complaints to the WTO. You can try to find some sort of international arbitration to deal with it. But those are very, very long-term solutions, right. Something that wouldn't necessarily affect the current condition and the current pressure put on the canola market in Canada.
Canola is one example. We've seen steel and aluminum tariffs, softwood tariffs, other trade measures coming from the States. Is this potentially just a reality we have to deal with in a globalized world and in a country that's a trading nation, essentially?
I think absolutely. Unfortunately, being a trading nation makes you vulnerable to trade. Right. I mean, it has its good parts and it has its bad parts. The bad parts being that states can use trade and imports and export tools in order to achieve political ends. And you just have to focus on having a diverse enough trade portfolio that when this does happen, you can either shift exports to another country, or you can address these issues through, as I said, international or multilateral or bilateral mechanisms that focus on arbitration. But it is something that is fundamental to the international trade system and something that Canada, as well as many other countries throughout Asia and throughout the rest of the world, have to deal with.
Does Canada have to be careful about setting a precedent that if it does what China wants, for example, it has to be wary that maybe other countries take note or that China makes a mental note that, okay, it was very effective the first time around, we can do it again?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, that means Canada has to be prepared to absorb a certain degree of economic pressure and economic pain in order to show that it's not going to succumb to coercion. It's a challenging problem set, and it's something that there's not a simple solution to, and particularly when you do have, as Canada does, a commitment to high quality engagement and making sure that you're following regulations and doing everything in line with international and national best practices. But there are lots of opportunities for Canada to diversify its export market. The CPTPP, as we talked about last time, with Japan, with Singapore, with other states in Southeast Asia, there's a lot of opportunity there. So if you need to shift canola export somewhere else, now is a really, really good time to do it.
Fair enough. Jeff, as always, a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
That's Jeff Reeves, Vice President of Research at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada.